Welcome back to the Talking Hedge. I'm Josh Kincaid, Capital Markets Analyst and host of your Cannabis Business Podcast. Today we've got Dr. Jim MacRae. He's the founder of Straightline Analytics. That's a company that leverages data and analytics to help policymakers form better policy and to help businesses thrive in competitive markets. So Jim, tell me about your recent article, Retail Cannabis Sales Surging in March and Flying Blind.
Published on High Blog a couple weeks back, an update with retail sales data through March of 2020, which covered the month leading up into the month of 420. And also right around the time that the governor was locking the state down and coronavirus was reaching people's attentions and things like that. So as it turned out, the month of March had the biggest spike in sales that this market has ever seen in Washington State. The highest prior sales ever for a month of retail, this is all pre-tax sales, was August of 2019, what I call the Hemp Fest bump. August is traditionally the biggest month. But was the first time it ever broke 100 million in retail sales pre-tax, did $102.8 million. According to last month's data, the month of March this year broke $112.8 million. They recast the numbers for some reason, and I have no explanation for this. It doesn't usually happen this way. They recast the numbers the other day when they released the April data. And what they released was April data that had 107.9 million in sales. So again, the second biggest sales month ever. But they recast March to be 108.1 million. And the funny thing is that virtually every penny of the missing data, of the missing sales from March, were reassigned to the month of February. It was about $4.7 million. So I don't know what was going on there. It's possible that they forgot that February had 29 days. It is possible, and they just, oops, but I don't know. Regardless, the 2 months in a row have totaled, no matter which way you look at it, somewhere between 225 million and $230 million of sales. That's a run rate every year of 1.25 billion. That's a full $250,000 more, full $250 million more than the state is currently forecasting. The state just released new forecast numbers yesterday. I have not looked at them yet. But as of 3 months ago, the last time they forecasted stuff, they were coming in just under $1 billion of sales, which they figured would yield them ultimately, 370 million of excise tax and various other taxes. But they're going to do $500 million in tax in the next 12 months from the looks of things in the state of Washington, taking into account the various bits and pieces of tax. This is just looking at quarterly sales from the beginning of 2018 through the beginning of 2020, where I have a full quarter of sales. And that's, pretty hefty growth from going to about 238 million 2 years ago to the following year, the first quarter doing 254 million, to this year it doing 299 million. That's very, very healthy growth. To put that in a little more perspective, this is the most recent monthly growth from the period of time. This is all internally consistent data. This is the MJ Freeway Akerna Leaf data system that is benignly killing our transparency into the Washington State market. It's really a non-functional system for all intents and purposes. It enables transactions to occur, but the ability to get data out of it is highly questionable. The data that are coming out of it are questionable. These retail sales data are probably the strongest data coming out of the LCB right now with respect to this market. And that is because the retailers are required to report to the Department of Revenue for their excise taxes on a monthly basis. And that's very accurate data for the most part, as long as people aren't defrauding the state. And the LCB has a feed into that. So these, although they make all kinds of noise, I'm pretty sure these are Department of Revenue supplied numbers. Well, you can see the spike that went up in March. Now that's, again, the coronavirus is hitting. We're coming up into a month of 420, where every day is 420. Twice a day is 420 of 420. But more importantly, by mid to the third week of March, the governor was very clearly on the verge of locking things down. And people weren't sure whether the stores would close or not. So I think you see a little bit of panic buying here. They're going to stock up before the month comes in. Okay, that trend of monthly sales, that is the biggest increase we've seen month on month ever. It really was rather phenomenal. And you'll note when I do that the point before the month of February is actually a dip down. February is often a dip down. In 2019, we had that horrific snowstorm that everybody snowed in for a week or two. That was a big dip down for that. And this dip is as big, and it was a pretty mild February this year. So I think when they recast the data most recently, a little bit of these sales actually go into February, so I'll accept that for now. One of the interesting things, now that the state is selling about $1 billion, the retail stores are selling north of $1.2 billion a year. It's going to be the run rate going forward. That is the pre-tax sales. On top of that is a 37% excise tax, a 6.5% state sales tax, whatever local sales taxes are in play, which can be anywhere from very small to about 3 and 4%. It averages out to about 2.7% statewide. So bottom line is, when you take a look at everything that's going on here, this is the breakdown of the actual out-the-door retail cannabis expenditures. So if you now take what customers are actually paying for cannabis at the retail stores and break that down with the assumption that retailers are doing a 3-to-1 markup. If they buy a product for $2, they're selling it for $6. If with that assumption, the breakout of every dollar that comes through the market, 45.6% of it is going to the retailer before they pay any taxes or anything or costs. 22.8% is going to the wholesaler, and the state or local jurisdictions are getting the rest of it. So one of the really interesting things to me on this is just at the retail transaction level. There's B&O taxes and all that stuff as well, but this is the stuff that relates to the transaction directly. 29.7% is going to the state in taxes. 22.8% is going to the people that spent 4 months growing the plants, packaging them, curing them, doing all that wonderful stuff. And 45.6% is going to the retailer. Not a big surprise there. Retailers' tax burden is such that that's a margin where they can make a profit, but it's not a ridiculous profit. I'm really concerned that the state is taking in more money than the wholesalers are. So that's all the farmers in the state together, plus all the processors together. And it's just, actually, this is the processor sales into retail. So there's a little bit of extra wholesaler revenue because some wholesalers sell to other wholesalers. We're not capturing that in this. But of every retail sale, only 22.8% is going to the people that grew the plant and packaged it, and 29.7% is going to the state. And what service and what benefit are the consumers of Washington getting out of that tax burden? Well, they're getting approximately 420. Ironically, it was 420 stores that were active in the month of March. 420 stores active, give or take. Scattered around the state in a non-random way. They tend to be clustered in neighborhoods in the bigger cities that zoning allows them. And then there are entire counties that don't have stores. There are entire counties that don't have medical certified stores. It's really, you're okay if you're in a big city in Washington State. If you're not, it's a little bit further away to get stuff and hard to get access. But the bottom line is the state has restricted access to the product to a degree. When you go into a store, there's a tremendous selection. I mean, that's I'd say the one big benefit of the regulated market is you can go into one location and see the offerings from 20 or 30 different wholesalers. Really, you start getting to know which retailers are stocking which stuff, and you can make your decisions accordingly. But the other thing that's supposed to be there is ensured safety of the product, by whatever regulatory definition is safe, and transparency as to what is in the product and what is not in the product that you're buying. So it's the safety and the accuracy of the labeling. And for many reasons, I don't want to talk about it too much today unless you want to get into it. I personally do not trust the labels on 502 on regulated product in the state. There's been a lot of work that's shown that the potency levels, the THC levels, and also, by the way, the terpene levels to a degree, are systematically inflated by some laboratories. And the market tends to reward the laboratories that are systematically inflating product, because if you have higher THC numbers and or higher CBD numbers, if you're going for the medical segment, your product has a tendency to sell at a higher price and more rapidly. So there's a real advantage to having higher numbers. And you would think in an ideal world that that would be resulting in all kinds of farmers out there really striving to get those numbers. And no doubt many of them are. But some of them appear to be striving, at least one of the tactics they're using to get those numbers is figuring out which labs are inflating results and giving them their business. So the lab data that are available out of Leaf's Karen's MJ Freeway piece of shit system are really virtually unusable. I'm working very closely with some folks right now trying to clean them up, and they're doing all the work, and I'm just getting a little bit of feedback. And they're getting to the point where we're beginning to see a signal in there, but eventually I'd like to go in and do another update to see which labs are dominating the market in terms of share of testing and what their average flower potencies are and things like that. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that work. I did notice, one thing I was able to get out of the Leaf system was the volume of testing being done by the various labs. And let's just say that the biggest labs in the state, when I looked at those data a few months ago, were the ones that I had called out 2 years ago as being problematic labs. They've really come to dominate the market in Washington State right now for testing. So my presumption from that is that the average label you see out there not only says it has more cannabinoids than it does, it probably says it has more terpenoids than it does. And most importantly, the simple fact that it is on the shelf says that it has passed the entire suite of quality assurance safety tests. And one of the things we showed in the earlier work was that the same labs in many instances that were inflating cannabinoids were failing to fail product at a normative rate. The one thing that a lot of people were failing was yeast and mold testing. And it's the Pacific Northwest, it's a moist environment where you're growing indoor, densely coupled plants trying to maximize your canopy. You're going to get a lot of moisture and humidity, you're going to get a lot of mold. And you're not supposed to use the chemicals necessary to reduce that. So a lot of product was failing the yeast and mold testing. The LCB's response to that was to remove yeast and mold testing from the panel of required tests. So, and immediately the failure rate shot down 10%, and it's 10% more product. It was actually 7%. 7% more product was suddenly available on the shelves in September of 2017 than would have been allowed, that would not have been allowed to be sold the month before. And that has just continued on. I would suspect that people are even less careful with mold and mildew right now on their products since nobody's even bothering to look for it. You obviously don't want to package something that is just crystal with powdery mildew and you're not likely to get too much return business. And retailers will probably get upset at that because their customers would get upset at them. But it's the molds that you can't see necessarily. Some of them are toxic. And to the best of my knowledge, the only cases in which there have been pretty good scientific demonstrations of people being killed through the consumption of cannabis, it's immunocompromised people that have gotten a good dose of aspergillosis out of their cannabis. And it's basically a yeast that's growing in there, and it gets established in the lungs and kills them. So that's unfortunate. But the state's making a lot of money off this, and the state is going to be hurting for money right now. So my estimate is that this market, these numbers alone, just the retail sales tax, represents approximately 2% of the state's revenue right now, their
Wow.
overall revenue. If you add in all of the secondaries, like I didn't include the B&O, which is a tiny fraction of a percentage. Every business has to pay business and occupation tax. If you count the employee salaries that are in there and all of the taxes, that the tax revenue that those employees are able to generate through spending their income in the state, all of those secondaries of all of the ancillary businesses that are supplying the wholesalers and retailers with things that are in turn taxed for their efforts and pay employees who generate economic activity. We're probably looking now that the cannabis market in Washington state represents no less than 3% of the revenue coming into the state government today, and it's growing. So, you know, I could see it hit 5% within the next few years. Now, certainly, if the state starts regulating this market in a sane manner, and appropriately is the word I was going to use, but you know, it's appropriate in that it works and they're generating $500 million of tax revenue right now. What's the issue? The Liquor and Cannabis Board, to a lesser degree the Department of Health, and to a minimal degree the Washington State Department of Agriculture, have basically, for all intents and purposes, turned their back on this product. The LCB treats it as if it's a poison. They treat it as if it's an illegal product. They're regulating it mindlessly in the same way that they regulate nicotine and alcohol, which are two poisons that can kill you readily. And they're actually regulating it much more strictly than they regulate alcohol. And to the tune that they have probably depressed the amount of business going through the regulated cannabis market in this state by no less than 40%. I personally think it's to the tune of about 50 to 60%, which means there's likely a very robust alternate way of sourcing cannabis in the state of Washington that does not have a tax burden associated with it.
You know what the comparison is with the alcohol industry, wine, for example, and I know that we allow for distilleries of liquor now. So with only 3% of revenue coming in the state from cannabis, how does that compare to other commodities like wine? Do you know?
I'm looking into it. Alcohol in general, if you look at alcohol in its totality, it's slightly bigger than this, but the alcohol taxes are kind of complicated. I'm working on it, by the way. I want to address exactly that question of when you look at the LCB as a business, what are the revenue sources they have? And it's basically nicotine, alcohol, and cannabis taxes, fees, and penalties. And I'm trying to get a total view of all of those because the penalties, you know, the fines and stuff that they apply to licensees are also part of the revenue stream that nobody ever seems to want to account for. Alcohol in total is still bigger than cannabis. I'm not sure how much bigger. There's hard liquor taxes, there's liter taxes on top of that. There's taxes on beer that are at the barrel taxes, plus the taxes at distribution. There's taxes if you buy it at retail. There's taxes if you buy it at wholesale. Wine, similarly, there's a different taxing system on different ways of getting it and channels that it goes through. It works out that it's a pretty big set of taxes, but cannabis is catching up to it. Cannabis has surpassed wine. It has not surpassed the totality of alcohol, but it has certainly surpassed wine with respect to the tax generation in the state of Washington right now. I don't have those exact numbers there, but I mean, I made that observation some time ago.
With retailers, they're making some of the most money when they can go 3x prices buying it from the wholesalers. Do you know how much the wholesalers are making per gram now? I saw somewhere it was around $3 a gram. It's the highest it's been in about 5 years. And that's when I quit growing. As soon as my light bills and everything were about $3 a gram. So once wholesale got down below, it was still medical. So I was able to buy pounds back then.
Oh, yeah. No, I saw the thing on Facebook the other day about the $3 a gram. And I've heard rumblings over the last 8 months that we could reasonably anticipate an increase in wholesale prices in the state. I haven't heard a good rationale for that. And I was a little surprised to see that thread the other day. I contributed to the thread, my opinion. And my opinion was basically this, that if those prices are going up, I think what it basically comes down to, let me take a step back. It makes little sense for me for the prices at retail to be, or the wholesale prices to be going up right now. because the production of cannabis in the state of Washington, in the regulated system alone, is clearly much greater than is being consumed out the door of the regulated system. The last I calculated, which was a couple of months ago, I estimated a low end of 4-fold and a high end of 8-fold, being, it's a range of 2. But we are producing in the state of Washington, the regulated growers are producing no less than 4 times the amount of cannabis that is being consumed in the state of Washington through the regulated channel. I personally think the best estimate is about 6-fold. It could be as high as 8-fold. Okay, I'm just giving the low end as 4-fold. Just assume that that's correct. That we're assuming that we're producing a lot more in the state regulated than is being sold out of retail.
We wouldn't be the only ones. Oregon has 6 billion joints equivalent just sitting there that they can't sell from 2018. So we're not the only ones.
And the feds expressed quite an interest in that when those data became available. I haven't been publishing this stuff too widely because I don't want to piss off all my friends in the business, but because the feds could really come down on this. Particularly when you consider, so look at the situation in Washington. We're producing at least 4 times as much as is being consumed. So inventories are presumably growing. A lot of product is being destroyed that wouldn't otherwise go. And an awful lot of it for a long time was going to extraction. I couldn't sell it in buds, so even though it is bud, I just sell it to the extractors so I can keep the lights on in my farm. At pennies on the gram type of thing. There's another possibility too, which is that some portion of that product, the 22% that wholesalers get right now of every out of the door thing, I could go to a farm today, a regulated farm, in theory, and give them twice what the retailer is giving them, and that would be 45.6% of what I pay out the door if I were to go to retail. So I could give them half of what I'm paying at retail, and they're getting twice from me what they would get from the retailer. We're basically cutting out this entire piece of it plus the overhead of the retailer. So I could buy it for half. The grower gets it for twice as much. Everybody's happy except the state and the regulated retailers. I expect that some of that is happening. And that's, by the way, totally off the book sales for the wholesaler. So I would be surprised if some isn't going out the back door, up the regulated channel. When you couple on top of that, the truth that we have a traceability system, I don't even want to call it a traceability system because it doesn't trace, a seed to sale tracking system that cannot tell you at any point in time how much product is anywhere in the system. You cannot look at that system and say, this farm should have 1,200 pounds in storage. This retailer should have this much in their shelves. They're a little better with the retailers, but they cannot tell with the wholesalers at all. So the only way they can tell the wholesalers is to go in there and audit their books. So, the whole point of a traceability system is that you can presumably have some enforcement people in the background looking at the data and saying, are we having any outliers emerge amongst our 1,500 licensees? Oh, look at this person's, selling to this store at a penny a gram, but every other store at $1 a gram. I wonder if there's a tied business arrangement there, something along those lines, things like that. If you have access to all the data, you can look for the kind of fraudulent, tax dodging, illegal type behavior that regulators are supposed to be interested in looking at. They also not efficiently do that today. They're flying blind, and they've been flying blind since November of 2018. Not completely blind. Let's just say that they have extraordinarily bad vision and they lost their glasses. That's kind of how they're regulating this market right now. So we've got gross overproduction, the inability of the LCB to have virtually any transparency into that overproduction, or where product's moving and when it's moving and how much it's moving for. And you've got the reality that the economics of this tax burden that the LCB has put in place on the system, that if you avoid that tax burden, you can make dramatically more profit. I mean, just everybody involved in the transaction can make dramatically more profit if they bypass the regulated system. I would be surprised, given the numbers, if some people weren't doing that. Every single regulated grower I know is extremely law-abiding, not counting federal laws, but extremely law-abiding, decent person who I doubt would ever want to cheat the tax man, would they be willing to risk their license and possibly their freedom by selling out the back door? I don't know. I mean, that's a judgment call people make. But if you've invested now, we're coming up on the 6th anniversary of this market. We have passed the 6th anniversary of when the first farm started, regulated farms started growing. If you've been, put your life savings into the game, you've been playing, you've been trying to do it, and as you mentioned earlier, you followed that spiral to the bottom of prices, where prices for a while there were in the $1 a gram level, $1 to $1.50 a gram level statewide for primo bud. That's kind of hard to survive in that sort of game. So quite a few farms have gone out of business. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but they are continuing to drop out every month. There's fewer and fewer farms that are licensed. There's also even fewer and fewer farms that appear to be selling. There are literally hundreds of licensed farms in the state that have not sold any products.
Producer processor licenses in Washington State used to go for $150,000 about 2 years ago, 2017, yep, maybe 2018, and now you'd be lucky if you can get 25 grand, and that's with a location and everything else.
Yeah, I've been seeing processor licenses for 20,000, and the processor license is where you make the money. So I mean, if you're good at it.
What does the rate of that consolidation look like? You mentioned less and less farms. When we first started, I think in 2016, we had approximately 14 to 1,800 farms. And don't we have somewhere near maybe 450 that are active?
There are 1,198 farms as of May 22nd of this year. That's the most up-to-date one I've got of the wholesalers. Again, the LCB stopped routinely supplying wholesaler licensing information in December upon the request of a couple of farmers, because some farms were being broken into. So they took down the map showing where they all were, and they also removed the detailed licensing information from the applicant file. I routinely use that information, so I am doing public record requests to get it on a regular basis. I do it monthly, so this is the most recent one I currently have. There's 1,198, so it's only gone down by about 200 over the last 4 years in terms of farms, whereas the number of retailers has only gone up by about 30, from 390 to about 420. There are
that's regulations too, right? Because regulations allowed from 1 store to 3 stores to 5 stores?
They're now allowed 5 stores per person, or per true party of interest, per entity. You're allowed 3 farms per entity and 3 processing licenses per entity now. When you look at retailers, there are 511 licensed, and 2 were temporarily closed, so it's really 513. The 2 temporarily closed probably got their wrists slapped for serving underage people. There's only a handful of violations that they will shut a store down for, and a temporary shutdown is kind of a special thing. You don't see that often. Closed permanent, these are the applications that since the last time they updated the file are cleared. The LCB has aggressively cleared the non-licensed applicants out of their retail cadre, because they've been pushing those retail license certificates. They're basically trying to build up to the equity thing where they can start doling out licenses to equity candidates in an racial equity type of move. But they've got it down now to, we have 513 stores licensed. 420 of them generated sales in the month of March. So what are the other 111 licensed stores doing? I don't know. I mean, honestly, they've got their licenses. They don't appear to be active. It's I don't know. And I just don't want to drive around the state and talk to 120 stores or get on the phone and talk to them, because the data tell me they're closed. So I doubt that I would get there, on the phone or traveling. But to your question, retailers seem to have plateaued at about 430 stores out of the 566 that they're supposed to be in the state. Remember that they initially allocated 334 stores at the beginning of the market, the recreational market, the adult use market. That was exactly the same number of stores as they had liquor stores when the LCB had the monopoly on liquor sales in the state. That closed down and right just before cannabis came on board. So they paid a consultant hundreds of thousands of dollars. The consultant came up with a fancy spreadsheet, and the LCB ignored it and said, we need 334 stores, because that's what they were used to regulating. So that was the rationale. It's as simple as that. And I'd love to have somebody at the LCB argue that point with me, that wasn't their decision-making process. That would be a fun argument. It would be a really fun debate. Then when medical rolled in 2 years later, 4 years ago, this coming July 1st, where medical, all of the dispensaries were shut down statewide, and they allocated an additional 222 stores for medical purposes. So the total now is allocated to be 556 stores. We only have 513 licensed, 6 years after the inception of the market, 4 years after the inception of the medical market. Why in heaven's name are we seeing only like 2/3 of the licensed stores selling? And why do we still have 150 of those non-licensed? Or sorry, 100 and what was the number I gave you? It's about 50. It's about 50 odd that are non-licensed. A lot of the ones that are non-licensed are things called retail title certificates, where the store, because the LCB allocated them not just to the state, but to specific geographies, I might have been an applicant that got a license in, I don't know, the Tri-Cities area somewhere. And the Tri-Cities area does not like cannabis stores. They don't want them. They put in all kinds of zoning and ordinances. They basically have banned or moratorium stores, so they can't open them. So here's somebody sitting on a license application. They have to renew it every year. They have to keep a building on lease, to keep it active, all that sort of shit. It was costing some of these folks like thousands and thousands of dollars a year just to maintain their hold on a license they couldn't use. So they finally got through to the LCB and said, look, through no fault of our own, the local jurisdiction doesn't want the store you allocated to us to open. So the LCB has said, we're going to put in these retail license certificates. You can just basically hold your license until such time as we decide something different, and that's either the local authority allowing stores or the LCB saying we'll do something else with them. So they've been aggressively over the last 12 months winnowing down their applicant list for retailers. And they're at the point now where the pending not issued, these 109, are the only ones that are kind of odd in the file. There's 109 applicants out there that are still in the file. They're obviously not going to license all of them per the original 556 allocation, but they're going to do something with them. And I expect that they're going to turn some of those into equity or diversity types of licenses, which the LCB, of course, will be in control of defining how they do. Just like they defined the application process for medical stores, ultimately to be something that it was more a function of how much money you had than whether you had a history of actually serving the patient clientele of the state with medical marijuana. They cut out a lot of the expertise when they did that. It was a shame. But so to your question, the farms are hanging on, man. We've only lost a couple of hundred in the last 4 years. Again, only for farms, of the ones that are, of the 1,198 that are licensed currently, only about 700 of them have generated any regulated sales in the last year, any at all, to either retailers or wholesalers. And again, my window into that is based on the LEAF data, so it's big caveat when I say detailed stuff now. But usually you at least pick up some signal if somebody's active. And I was being I think I allowed, if they sold $10 or more, I considered them active. And then, people just trying the system out will enter a $10 fee just to see it. So I've overcounted. But 700 growers sold something last year. Of the 1,100, some that are, of the 1,198 that are licensed. So only 63% of the stores, or of the farms that are licensed, have been active in business in terms of revenue generation. And we have 4 to 6 times the production capacity in the state that is being consumed out of the regulated system. Where is all that cannabis going?
Where is it going? So before we wrap this up, I want to know what your crystal ball prediction is, having looked at the data, where we're going to go. It's a crazy time. My crystal ball prediction says we fast track delivery for Washington State, and federal legalization will happen a lot faster than anybody ever anticipated to fill those federal deficits. What does your crystal ball say?
I believe that we are going to see, I agree with you. I believe we're going to see it quicker than most people are anticipating right now. Part of it is going to be really the economic impact of the coronavirus. The Washington State looks to be down somewhere in the 15 to 20% on the revenue line. Since we don't have income taxes here, everything's based on sort of sales taxes and property taxes and things like that, consumption taxes. They're really going to be hurting hard. They'll be looking for money all over the place. They've already frozen new hires. They've offered voluntary retirement programs to all public servants in the state right now. They're just gearing up to try to figure out how they can generate more revenue. Point number one, if they managed and regulated this market correctly, or if they ran it like a business, I mean, like honestly, this is the stuff I used to do in pharma, looking at what the potential for markets were and stuff like that. They could double the taxable revenue that is going through this system. They could double it. And by the way, I could make an argument that since some of that would be at the expense of alcohol, for sure, and possibly some of it at the expense of nicotine, that it would be a net positive for public health and safety to shift some of the consumption away from those more noxious, poisonous substances to this thing that, if anything, is medicinal. They could double their revenue. They could take the $500 million a year they're getting now, and it could become $1 billion a year. Now, if it did that, it would suddenly be 5 to 6% of the state's total income generation, revenue generation. So I hope that they remove the law enforcement attitude that the LCB has. I hope they get every single member of that board out of there, every one of them. Russ Hauge is an old prosecutor from Kitsap. He's a law enforcement dude, not exactly pro-cannabis. Jane Rushford, the chair of the board, she seems more concerned about limiting public input than anything else in her proxy right now. And Ollie Garrett, who is, let's just say, their minority person on the board, is in charge of their equity initiatives and things like that. And I've followed her work very closely over the last couple of years, and kudos to her for doing it. But we're a couple of years after that work started, and the LCB, and to the best of my knowledge, has made no progress on that. So, I mean, they need somebody in that board that actually understands something about cannabis other than the current belief, which is the people that use it are bad, the people that sell it are bad, they should all be in prison. But we've been told to regulate them, so we will as fiercely as we can, which is what they're doing it. So what's the future in Washington? I believe the regulators will begin to realize that the current way that is being regulated, which is without a traceability system and by an organization that is stifling the market, really they're stifling it, that those two things are bad and that they could generate easily $500 million more a year if they did it more intelligently. In their sleep, they could generate $300 million more a year, which is over almost $1 million a day, statewide. So I think you're going to see some changes there. I don't know what form they're going to take. Clearly, the enforcement division within the LCB is already undergoing some transformation. The Himmler-Heimlich, or whatever it was, the report that came out a couple of years back that was extremely critical of how they did enforcement. When you look at the data that spits out from the enforcement division, their behavior changed almost overnight, at least in some of the measurable things. They started issuing a lot fewer violations, a lot more warning letters. They shifted their attention to different things. But as it is, when you look at the LCB as a total organization, and I am beginning to look at it, I put on the hat as if I'm the chief executive officer, and I've got this dysfunctional company underneath me. How can I make it better? The LCB being the dysfunctional company. And so I'm gathering data that I would use in that role. And when you look at just how they're allocating resources, human resources within the LCB, it's idiotic. It really is idiotic. And that will be something that comes under close scrutiny as the government tries to cut its costs dramatically over the next year or next 6 months, certainly coming into the next legislative session. So I think the LCB is going to be smaller. I'm hoping it's going to be smarter. And I'm hoping that they will remove some of the unreasonable regulation this market suffers right now. I also really, truly hope that they take a look at the tax structure. It can be done in such a way that it's revenue neutral. It's not easy, but it can be done in such a way that it's revenue neutral. And the LCB is not the organization to figure out how to do that. And indeed, I don't even know if we have people in government that are, but there are folks around that know how to do stuff like that, and maybe they'll bring some of them on board to help them. But where do I see it going? I see it being legal within a year or two, and that'll be largely dependent upon the feds, of course. I think when it does go legal, I really hope the Washington State has had a newer, fresher LCB in place for at least a year before that happens. Because if the borders open tomorrow and cross-market commerce, cross-state commerce were allowed in this, and cross-country commerce even were allowed in this, Washington State would be screwed. We would not be able to compete with the other states because of the mismanagement of the LCB. I'm about to write a very critical article about Nevada because I've been trying to get data from them for the better part of a year now. And they just sent me a data dump, and it was their lab data basically, because I did some work earlier that showed there were some problems in their labs very similar to the way there were up here. They just gave me a complete data dump of their potency and quality assurance data for about a 2-year period that I requested. But they refused to give me the names of the labs, the names of the growers, or the names of the retailers. So I've got this file. It's just every test that's ever been done with all of the business identifiers stripped. And it was a little bit of a passive aggressive move, since my public record request was very specifically to include those things. And I made reference to the new law that passed last year that said they could do it. They're saying they're not going to do it. So I am going through the data. I think they gave me something that I can't digest or do anything with. They're wrong. So I'll be putting something together, and if the initial signal I'm getting out of the data is true, I'm going to just basically make the point that in Nevada, you don't know what you're getting when you buy your product. You really don't. The same is the case in Washington today. And that is unfortunate. I mean, when I look at Oregon is doing a better job at testing than we are. California, even though they've got growing pains, are doing a better job of testing than we are. The LCB, in conjunction with the Washington State Department of Agriculture, has done hundreds, if not now thousands, of tests for pesticides in their little secret shopper complaint-driven, program. The last I looked at it, which was at the end of the second year of that program, which is now gone for about 3.5 years, they had found, I believe it was 275 instances where products had levels of pesticides where they above and beyond the limit. About 80% of those were more than 2 times the allowed limit. There was not a single LCB mandated recall in that entire period of time. Not a bit of product was recalled by them. There were a total of, I believe, during that period of time, 8 voluntary recalls by growers. 6 of those 8 seemed to be aligned with violations for pesticides. The other 2, I couldn't figure out where they came from.
And it took Uncle Ike's program, the Uncle Ike's store, the OK program, to fix that. But we're going to have to leave it at that. Jim, where can people find you in order to follow up with all of these files and everything that you're doing?
The best place to find my stuff is probably, I'll give you the direct address to my blog. It's in my commercial page, but it's www.untitled www.higintelligence.org, H-I-G-H intelligence, one word, .org. And that'll take you right to my blog page. I've got the one with the summarizing the revenue up now. I'm starting a series of articles, which I'm hoping the first one will come out in the next day or two, that is called Aspiring to Mediocrity. And it's going to be a critical appraisal of regulation of cannabis within the state of Washington that is going to be highly critical of the LCB, highly critical of the Department of Health, and a little bit critical of the Washington State Department of Agriculture, and a number of the government agencies whose purpose is to keep government agencies under control, like the auditor, the Office of the Chief Information Officer, that keep signing off on these stupid MJ freeway contracts, things like that. There's a lot of groups that are supposed to control the regulators that have effectively enabled, through inaction on their part, really egregious behavior on the part of the LCB over the last few years. And
definitely looking forward to it. We're going to have to leave it at that. You can also be found at straightlineanalytics.biz.
Gosh, I appreciate it. I like your podcast.
Appreciate it, man. Talk to you soon.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Jim. With that, we're going to roll this one up. I'm Josh Kincaid. This is The Talking Hedge. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, or don't, and I'm out. Don't forget to smash that like button on your way out and check out these other videos that we've got.